Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Right, first this morning, Labour say the Lords spoke for the country last night when they blocked the government over its proposed cuts to tax credits. It means the Chancellor, George Osborne, will now have to rewrite his plans to cut the welfare budget and potentially have to find some of the £4.4 billion worth of tax cut credit savings elsewhere. The Chancellor also says he will look at how he can ease the impact of his proposed reductions in tax credits on the lowest paid workers. Throughout the programme today, we're keen to hear from you to give us a sense of whether you think the Lords did the right thing last night, stood up to the government in order to protect those who'll lose out the most, or if you think the unelected second chamber has overstepped the mark. Traditionally, the House of Lords don't block the government's financial plans. Here's how the debate in the Lords unfolded.
I want to be able to go home this evening knowing that I have done everything I can do to stop the wrong-headed, ill-thought-through piece of legislation.
It's about, surely, respect for those who strive to do everything we ask of them and now find themselves punished for doing what's right.
Do you want people who hitherto have been depending on work and tax credits now to be driven to the loan sharks of this country?
I think it is perfectly possible, with tweaking it, to take more from the upper end of the tax credit scale and less from the lower end of the tax credit scale.
They were civilised, but it was brutal. The government defeated on its cuts to tax credits not once.
My Lords, they have voted contents 307, not contents 277. Therefore, the contents have it.
But twice. The plans thrown out by the Lords.
My Lords, they have voted contents 289, not contents 272.
Unelected Labour and Liberal Lords have defeated a financial matter passed by the elected House of Commons, and David Cameron and I are clear that this raises constitutional issues that need to be dealt with. However, it has happened, and now we must address the consequences of that. I said I would listen, and that's precisely what I intend to do.
Well, David Cameron has now ordered a review, not just a review, a rapid review into the House of Lords' relationship with the Commons on financial matters. After 10, we'll explain exactly what the tax credit changes could mean for you as a result of the votes last night. Let's talk right now, though, to the independent crossbench peer, Baroness Meacher, who put forward one of the motions in the Lords, delaying the cuts and sending them back to the Commons effectively for a rethink. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Victoria.
Let's talk first about what is most important to our audience, which is, as a result of the votes last night, does it mean that the lowest paid workers who are going to be hit the hardest by the cuts to tax credits won't be hit as hard?
My understanding from the Chancellor is that he will now make arrangements for the transition so that hard-pressed families won't lose some tax credit immediately on the 1st of April, but these cuts will be phased in, which will just make them a little bit easier to manage for people. But in the end, the cuts will happen. Of course, it is not the job of the House of Lords to tell the Chancellor what to do. He will decide with the elected chamber.
Right, but does as a result of the defeats that you inflicted on the government in those two votes, does that mean he has to ameliorate the cuts somehow?
I think he has to ameliorate the cuts because he can see that the feeling in the country is not with him. And I think in the elected House, the Conservative backbenchers are also panicking. And I think the government will lose a vote on Thursday in the elected House. So I think the Chancellor knows he has to do something, and we have simply held the regulation. We haven't approved it, so that gives him time to do what the elected government and the elected House decide should be done. And that's a relief, I think, to everybody.
Right. I mean, your particular amendment was that you wanted the government to go back and have a look at the impact of the cuts on the poorest workers. Well, we already know the impact. 8 out of 10 workers will be better off, 2 out of 10 will be worse off.
The problem is the people at the bottom, for example, people with cancer who can't work full-time, people with a disabled child, people who are carers. These are the people with very small incomes, and these are the people, as I understand it, who are going to lose most. And they will not have that loss made up by the tax threshold increase, although I support it, the tax threshold increase, but they will not benefit from those things, the people at the bottom. So those are the people that I am most concerned about, and I hope the Chancellor will now protect them.
OK, right. We've asked our audience to tell us if they think you and your fellow peers did the right thing, whether it's right for an unelected group of peers to effectively defeat the elected government, elected only in May, on its manifesto. Ian texted to say, "Alleluia, the House of Lords has actually done something worthy of note. Maybe it isn't a waste of money after all. Well done, your honours." Alan has emailed to say, "I always thought the Lords were a waste of time, but I've now changed my mind. I'm full of admiration for those who stood against oppressive cuts against the less well-off in our community. If constitutional powers have been exceeded, then good. It shows we need to examine a more active role for the Lords." And Alan tweets, "What a wonderful day for democracy. Well done, all you lords and ladies who stood for what is right in our society." Despite what some members of our audience think, and that is obviously only a tiny snapshot, you could be in trouble. I mean, the government says it's going to have this rapid review to determine what sort of relationship the Lords has with the House of Commons. I mean, what do you understand by a rapid review?
Well, presumably reconsidering our powers. I mean, I think it was very courageous, if I may say so, particularly of my colleagues, the crossbenchers, to support my amendment when the threats were already there. The government were threatening to disable the House of Lords, and yet we went through with this motion because we are so concerned about the impact of these deep cuts on these very vulnerable people. But, you know, the fact is the government are all-powerful, they can do what they like, but what I hope is that they will be honourable and respect the fact that certainly my amendment only asks them to think again and only asks them to listen to their elected colleagues in the House of Commons, who will be having a debate and a vote on Thursday. And I anticipate the government will lose that vote, and that's the important vote, and the government really need to listen to the elected House.
Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thank you. Get some sleep. I know you haven't had much. Now, the Chancellor, George Osborne, says he'll draw up plans to soften the impact of changes to tax credits on low-income families after the House of Lords inflicted a couple of really significant defeats on the government last night. Here's what we've learned from the votes on tax credits and some things we haven't. The government has said this morning that any changes will be announced in the autumn statement. That's the mini budget the government has next month. There's talk of a constitutional crisis, and the government's ruling nothing out about what it could do to the Lords because they're so cross about those defeats. David Cameron's already ordered a rapid review, quote unquote, into the House of Lords' relationship with the Commons. So the key question is, of course, will these tax credit changes in their old form still happen? And the answer is, we kind of don't really know yet. Expect to hear more details over the coming months, although George Osborne did say he would look at helping in the transition period. And what will the government do to the House of Lords once the review is completed? Again, we don't know yet. So what does this mean for George Osborne's chances of being our next Prime Minister when David Cameron stands down? We don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know, as you may have gathered. But it's not the news Mr Osborne would have wanted, and it's surely good news for his rival for the leadership of the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Chris Mason, who's at Westminster. OK, where does this leave people on tax credits? Where does this leave the Chancellor? Where does this leave Boris Johnson? Well, where does this leave the Lords?
To borrow a phrase, Victoria, that you were just using there, I don't know. I think we need to use that perhaps again and again with a few of these questions. As you say, there are three main implications. The implications for tax credits, so yes, we've heard that there'll be some tweaking going on in the autumn statement in around about a month's time. But exactly what kind of tweaking? Could there, for instance, be a delay so that this only affects new recipients of tax credits and there is a slow phasing in of the changes for those who are currently recipients. That would mean that there wouldn't be, for instance, letters dropping on doormats around about Christmas telling millions of households that they were going to get a big drop in their household income. We don't know that that's what the Chancellor is going to do, and there'd be huge cost implications for doing that, but no doubt that is one thought amongst a good number of others being kicked around in the Treasury. George Osborne is actually in the House of Commons in the next hour or so answering Treasury questions, so who knows, we might get some sort of insight there into what exactly the government is planning. Then, as you say, there's the whole implication for the House of Lords and what the government does with the relationship between the elected House of Commons and the House of Lords. Chris Grayling, the leader of the Commons, saying this morning, nothing is ruled out. He also, though, said nothing is ruled in, so back to that theme about us not actually knowing precisely what they are going to do. And then the bigger question about what this might mean for who our next Prime Minister might just be. Of course, it might also mean not a great deal, because politics moves rather quickly, doesn't it? And people might quickly forget this. But there is no disputing this has been a rough 24 hours at the end of a rough week for George Osborne. So enter a politician with blonde hair who you might just have heard of. Here's Boris Johnson. He knows how to do a photo opportunity, doing a tug of war this morning outside City Hall on the banks of the Thames. This is a event organised by the Royal British Legion ahead of Poppy Day. Boris Johnson reflecting that his shoes, office shoes, weren't exactly appropriate attire for grabbing hold of a bit of rope and trying to win a tug of war on grass. I think he won one contest and lost the other. Here were his reflections on a rough old time for George Osborne and what this meant for the government.
Look, I think the House of Lords is in grave danger of pushing its luck, frankly. This is not what they're there to do. They're a revising chamber. They're not there to throw out financial bills from the elected House of Commons. And I think the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are right to feel pretty aggrieved about that. The Chancellor has said George has said he's in listening mode, and that is completely right. Obviously, what everybody wants, what George wants, what we all want, is a way of reforming what is a grossly unfair system in a way that helps the poorest and the neediest.
So was Boris Johnson in trouble-causing mood this morning? No, he wasn't really. That was very much the government line we were hearing from the Mayor of London, setting out, as they see it, the injustice of the unelected House of Lords causing them so much grief last night. There wasn't any hints, despite the attempts that we tried again and again to hand him enough rope, to extend my tug-of-war metaphor to breaking point, to see if he would say something a little bit spiky about George Osborne. He resisted the temptation.
There's a thing. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. A couple more comments from you, because we wanted to get some kind of feeling from you about whether you thought the Lords had done the right thing last night. It's a tiny snapshot. It's unscientific, but hey, that's never stopped us before. Let's have a look. Abdiwali says, finally, the House of Lords steps in. These cuts are unacceptable, and it's great that Labour and Liberal peers saw some sense. This tweeter says, the House of Lords acted correctly and proved that true democracy exists and that we should not be bullied by the House of Commons. True democracy, unelected. Interesting. And one more for now, if I can find it. What is the point of a second chamber if its sole purpose is to wave through bad government legislation? That's from Fred Litton. Keep those coming in.
I've been getting away with it all my